second Palm Sunday perspective I want us to think about is Jesus' understanding of it all. We've thought about the crowd, and pretty obviously their thoughts focus on the prospect of a king who would come to the throne and make life easy for them all. Those familiar with the Old Testament scriptures may have recalled passages which could be used to justify such a view. But what about Jesus? Well, he doesn't exactly discourage the crowd. The way he enters the city actually encourages the idea that he is a king. When Matthew and John tell this same story in their Gospels, they endorse this by actually quoting the Zechariah text we noticed a few minutes ago. So Jesus does enter Jerusalem as a king. Some of the onlookers may have thought it strange for a king to arrive without an army behind him, but nevertheless it is as a king that he comes. All this was quite deliberate on Jesus' part. He could have arrived by the back door, so to speak, as he had done at least once previously. But this time there is no attempt to hide his arrival, and on the contrary, he goes out of his way by arranging for the donkey, goes out of his way to draw attention to his arrival in a royal manner. It's almost certain that he intends to fulfil the Zechariah prophecy about a king arriving on a donkey. So I asked you to think a moment or two ago about whether the crowd was on the right track, and it would seem the crowd are correct. But there is more to be said, and this is a big but. Jesus agrees with their opinion that he is a king, but there were other thoughts in Jesus' mind that would not have occurred to most of the crowd. For a long time, the shadow of the cross had hung over Jesus. He had tried to teach his disciples about this, but without much success. Even the disciples thought along the same lines as the crowd, hoping for a king who would come in glorious splendour. Again, if we go back to Mark chapter 10, a few verses earlier than the Bartimaeus story, we find James and John making a request of Jesus. You'll find this in chapter 10, verse 37. They ask him, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." What was in their mind was Jesus' glory. Suffering and death for Jesus was something not on the agenda for James and John, nor it would seem for any other of the disciples. But immediately before that selfish request, Jesus had said, "We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law." He then went on to speak about his death at the hands of Gentiles, which in that context, of course, meant the Romans and could mean nothing but death by crucifixion. Jesus knew well what was around the corner as he entered Jerusalem that Palm Sunday. But as well as knowing what lay ahead, he also knew why. For again, as we read in chapter 10 verse 45, if you want to look at it, "The Son of Man," he said, "the Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many." His death was not a tragedy which would have been better avoided. On the contrary, it had an incredible positive purpose. Nothing to do with any need of his own, but totally with our need, the need for our sin to be dealt with, our need of forgiveness. So, was the crowd right? Well, yes, because Jesus does enter Jerusalem as a king. Only not the sort of king the crowd expects and the disciples hope. Rather, he was a king who would come to his throne via the cross. It's not hard to see why the crowd would have been happy to ignore that uncomfortable detail, even if they had known what was in Jesus' mind. we would all naturally prefer to focus on the easiest, the happiest, the most comfortable outcome. But Jesus knows that is not the way. Before I come back to the last part of this message, perhaps you would like to turn back to that Zechariah prophecy. It's an easy reference to remember, Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. And if you're not sure about Zechariah, it's the second last book of the Old Testament. So Zechariah 9:9, have a look at that again and see if you can find a clue in that little verse that might have helped the crowd see that the Messiah was not the sort of king that they were hoping for.